It was early spring in the northern parts of Michigan, the kind of place most people think of when they imagine deep forests and isolated lakes. I had rented a small cabin by the edge of a quiet, dark lake for the weekend. It was the perfect escape from the grind of my day-to-day life. Work had been exhausting, and I needed some time alone to clear my head. The cabin was rustic, just enough comfort to keep it from feeling like a shack. Wooden walls, a single bed with a quilt thrown over it, a stove in the corner, and a few mismatched chairs. It was simple, but it was all I needed. I had arrived the day before, unpacked my bags, and settled in for a night of reading. The moonlight reflected off the water, shimmering in a way that made everything feel peaceful and distant. There was no one around for miles, and the silence felt like a weight pressing down on me. Heavy, but somehow comforting. But when I woke up the next morning, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything specific. No strange noises, no sudden chill in the air, nothing overtly wrong. But there was an uneasy tension in the cabin, like the stillness of the forest had crept inside with me, settling over everything I touched. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I went about my day anyway. I went out for a hike along the nearby trails, followed the shoreline, and did my best to ignore the feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. The forest around me was dense, full of towering pines that looked as old as the land itself. The ground was still a little damp from the rain the night before, the air thick with moisture. That evening, as the sun began to set, I found myself sitting on the porch of the cabin, sipping coffee, trying to enjoy the silence. I had planned on staying inside that night, maybe watching a movie or reading, but the stillness of the evening was too tempting. It was peaceful out there, too peaceful. As the light began to fade, I noticed something strange in the distance. A figure. At first, I thought it was just the play of shadows, the light shifting in the trees, but when I focused, I realized there was someone standing by the tree line. It was a man, or at least I assumed it was. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out much detail, but the outline of his body was unmistakable. He stood motionless, staring toward the cabin. I felt a flicker of unease crawl down my spine. I told myself it was nothing, probably a hiker or someone else who rented a cabin nearby. But my instincts told me something was wrong. No one was supposed to be here. The nearest cabin was miles away. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside to get a better look. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the man turned and disappeared into the woods, vanishing as quickly as he'd appeared. My heart raced. I stood frozen in place, staring into the dark trees. The woods seemed to close in around me, the sounds of the forest fading to a hollow silence. It was almost as if the world had gone still, holding its breath. I scanned the shadows, but there was no sign of him. He was gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity. Then, in a moment of nervous laughter, I shrugged it off. It was probably just some other lost soul hiking in the woods, I told myself. But the feeling lingered. I didn't like it. That night, I decided to lock the doors, even though I didn't usually do that when I stayed in cabins. The isolation always felt more like a privilege than a threat. But tonight was different. I spent the evening inside, the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the occasional crack of the firewood, the only sounds breaking the silence. I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the walls made my skin prickle. I awoke the next morning feeling even more on edge than before. I forced myself to shake off the feeling, but it clung to me like the dampness of the morning fog. I went through my usual routine, coffee, a bit of breakfast, and decided to get some work done. But as I sat at the small wooden table, typing away on my laptop, I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. There again, a shadow, but this time it was closer. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood up, walking over to the window. The man, He was standing at the edge of the forest again. Just like before, he wasn't moving. He was still. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my jacket, the flashlight, and headed outside. I wanted to confront him, to figure out who this person was. But as I stepped onto the porch, the man turned and disappeared once again. I stood there, breathing heavily, my pulse racing in my ears. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone was out there. Someone was watching me. I spent the rest of the day inside the cabin, locked up tight. The sunlight seemed to slip away faster than usual, and by evening, I was on edge, my nerves stretched thin. Every noise outside seemed louder, more menacing. The wind howled through the trees, sending shadows skittering across the walls, but nothing else moved. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. By the time night fell, I was no longer willing to chalk it up to nerves or paranoia. I knew something wasn't right. I knew someone was out there. I spent the entire night awake, sitting on the couch with a knife in hand, watching the dark window. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke up to the sound of scratching at the door. I froze. The noise was slow, deliberate. Someone was outside. The scratching stopped, and for a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of my breath. My heart was pounding in my chest as I slowly, cautiously, stood up and approached the door. My hands shook as I reached for the handle, but before I could open it, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving away. I stood still, listening. The sound of crunching leaves underfoot grew fainter. He was leaving, but why? I didn't wait around to find out. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed my things inside, and rushed to the truck. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short gasps. I had no intention of sticking around to find out what this man wanted. As I started the truck and pulled away, I looked back at the cabin, at the small glass structure surrounded by dark, towering trees. The cabin that had once seemed like the perfect escape now felt like a prison. I didn't go back. Couldn't. I still don't know who the man was. I never found out. But when I made it back to town, I found out that someone had been spotted in the area before. A couple of days earlier, a man matching the same description had been seen near the trails, asking hikers odd questions about the cabins. He wasn't a local. No one knew who he was or where he came from. But what bothered me the most was that nobody had reported him missing. It was like he had never existed at all. I never went back to that cabin. Couldn't. It still feels like there's someone out there, watching me from the dark trees. It was September of 2013, and I had just turned 34. I had been working construction in San Diego for nearly a decade, and my body was wearing down. My knees ached constantly, and my back would stiffen up in the morning like concrete. I wasn't ready to stop working yet, but I needed a break from the daily grind and city noise. My Uncle Tom had passed away earlier that year, and he'd left me his old cabin tucked in a wooded corner of northern Arizona, a couple miles south of the New Mexico line, near a place called Alpine. It wasn't much. A single-story wooden box with a tin roof and a porch that creaked even when the wind wasn't blowing. Still, it had a wood stove, an outhouse out back, and a stocked shed. I figured I'd spend a month there and see if it helped me reset. I packed up my old Ford Ranger, loaded it with canned food, bottled water, a 12-gauge I hadn't fired in years, some basic tools, and a cooler full of dry ice and meat. I brought a thick notebook, figuring I'd write or at least sketch. I didn't bring a phone. I told my younger brother Rob where I was going and when I planned to be back. That was it. I left on a Sunday morning and hit the dirt road up to the cabin by dusk. The last 2 miles were just winding gravel, no signage, nothing but trees on either side. The truck jolted on the washboard surface, tires crunching over rocks. I felt every bump in my spine. The cabin looked just like I remembered from when I was a kid. We used to visit Uncle Tom every few summers. I hadn't been there in nearly 15 years, but it hadn't changed. The forest, though, that felt different. Thicker, darker. The trees looked older, and there was this weird sense of quiet that made me uneasy. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind that made you realize how far you were from anyone. The first couple of days were uneventful. I chopped some wood, swept out the cabin, set mousetraps, and cleaned the old lanterns. I hiked around a bit during the day and wrote short thoughts in my notebook at night by lamplight. The days were warm enough, but nights dropped fast and cold. I slept with a heavy quilt over me and the shotgun near the bed. Not because I was scared, just because it seemed like the right thing to do in a place like that. It was around the fourth night that I noticed something strange. I'd just come back from the outhouse, maybe 20 feet behind the cabin. It was around midnight. I'd brought a lantern with me, and when I came back inside and shut the door, I thought I heard a soft rustle behind the cabin. It was faint, like dry leaves being stepped on. I figured it was a raccoon or maybe a deer, but I still stepped out onto the porch and shined the lantern around. The light didn't catch anything, and after a moment I went back inside. The next morning, I walked out behind the cabin and looked around. The soil there was soft from recent rain, and I spotted something that made me stop cold. There were footprints, bare ones, human. They weren't mine. Too wide, too long. The big toe on the right foot stuck out in a weird angle, almost sideways. I crouched down and stared. The prints came in from the woods, stopped about 10 feet from the outhouse, then circled back the way they came.
No xuprints.
Just those long, strange bare feet. I told myself it had to be a local, maybe some weird hunter or off-gridder who didn't like shoes. It didn't make much sense, but it was better than admitting I didn't have a clue. I tried to shrug it off, but I stayed close to the cabin the rest of the day and kept the shotgun loaded. The next night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, thinking I heard scratching or tapping somewhere outside. Each time I got up and checked, there was nothing. Around 4 a.m., I sat on the porch with the lantern turned down low, wrapped in a blanket, just watching the woods. I didn't see anything, but I felt watched. That was the worst part. The feeling didn't come and go. It stayed with me, like something out there was staring through the trees, just out of reach. On the sixth night, I finally saw it. It was just after 2 a.m. I'd been asleep for maybe an hour when a soft thump outside woke me. I froze and listened. Then I heard it again. Thump, scrape. It sounded like someone dragging something heavy across the porch. I grabbed the shotgun and crept over to the window. I left the lantern off. The moon was bright enough that I could see shapes outside. And there, hunched over near the woodpile, was a figure. Naked, pale, but not quite human. Its limbs were too long. The way it moved, it was like it didn't know how to use its body properly. Its arms dangled down almost to its knees. It sniffed the air, head twitching left and right. Then it stood up and I could see it fully. Its face was wrong. The mouth was too wide. The eyes were sunken, almost hollow. It looked like someone wearing a human skin but not quite understanding how to make it fit. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared. It turned toward the cabin and stepped closer. I ducked beneath the window and waited. A minute passed, then two. Then I heard it move away. When morning came, I stepped outside, shotgun in hand. The woodpile had been torn apart, logs tossed everywhere. I circled the cabin and found more of those footprints in the dirt, but this time there were drag marks, claw marks. I followed them about 50 feet into the woods before they vanished. I should have left that day. I know that now, but I told myself it could have been anything. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was an animal, and my brain twisted it up with sleep and fear. I didn't want to admit I was scared, so I stayed. The following night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, shotgun across my lap, lantern turned off. Around 1:30, I heard it again. This time it was on the roof. I heard it climb up from the back, slow and clumsy. Then a thud above me. Then the sound of something crawling, no rhythm to it. Just random shifting, dragging, then silence. I didn't move. I stared at the ceiling, muscles locked, barely breathing. At one point, I think I dozed off for a second, because the next thing I remember was the sound of something sharp tapping against the tin roof, like claws. I waited until dawn before I moved. That morning, I went outside and looked up. There were scratch marks on the roof, deep and long. Some looked fresh, others older. I thought about leaving. I even packed a bag. But I kept thinking, what if it followed me? What if it was only this bold because I was alone? Part of me thought I could wait it out. That night, everything changed. I was inside, lantern burning low, shotgun cleaned and loaded, sitting at the table. I heard a knock, a soft, slow knock at the front door. My chest went tight. Another knock, then silence. I didn't move. Then I heard footsteps around the side of the cabin. Then scratching on the wall. Not loud, but constant. It circled the cabin slowly, like it was testing me. Then all at once it stopped. I waited. Then I heard something worse. It was breathing, right outside the window, low and ragged. Bit. I couldn't bring myself to look. I sat there, staring straight ahead, hand gripping the shotgun until my knuckles went white. The breathing faded after a few minutes. I didn't move all night. In the morning, I found something by the door. It was a dead rabbit, but it wasn't torn apart like something a predator would do. It had been skinned, not butchered, peeled, clean, careful cuts. Its eyes were missing. Its ears were folded into its mouth. I started the truck around noon. I didn't even grab everything. I just shoved what I could into the bed, threw the shotgun on the seat, and got the hell out. I made it down the mountain and checked into a roadside motel by dark. I didn't sleep, just sat on the bed, shotgun next to me, door locked, chair braced under the knob. A few days later, I went back with Rob. I didn't tell him what I saw, just said someone had been prowling around. We cleaned up the cabin, took some tools and valuables, and boarded it up. We haven't been back since. I never reported it. What would I even say? I didn't tell anyone else, not really. But I know what I saw. I know what it was. Not a ghost. Not a story. Not something from a movie. Something old. Something that doesn't care if we believe in it. Something that knows the woods better than we ever will. It wore a shape, but it wasn't a person. It moved wrong. It watched me. It waited, and I let it get close. That was 12 years ago. I've never been back to that part of Arizona. I don't camp. I don't hike. And I don't sit with my back to a window, because I still don't know if it's done with me. And if it ever remembers how I smelled, how I moved, how I sounded, it might come find me again. My name's Daniel. This happened in 2016 when I was 32. I was working construction jobs in and around the Midlands back then, mostly freelance stuff. I take what I could get. Shed building, fencing, roofing, all that. It wasn't stable, but it paid the bills. That year, I got offered a long-term job out near the Peak District, in a place not far from Buxton. A guy wanted to renovate an old stone cabin he'd inherited from his uncle. The place was completely isolated, sitting halfway up a mossy slope in the woods. It had been empty for a few years, no electricity, no running water, no roads. You had to hike 15 minutes just to get to it. He needed someone to stay up there for a month, maybe more, and bring the place back into shape. Fix the roof, clear out the inside, maybe do some masonry. I agreed. The money was decent, and I'd be on my own, which I preferred. I packed up my gear, tools, clothes, a sleeping bag, a portable gas stove, a cooler box, and enough dry food to last 2 weeks, and drove out there in my old Ford Transit. The guy met me at a pub just outside the village and handed me a thick set of keys and a laminated map. Then he drove off without much small talk. I followed the map, parked where the road ended, and hiked up the rest of the way. The cabin was old, early 1900s at least, but solid. Thick stone walls, wooden window frames swollen from years of rain, and a slate roof with a few missing tiles. The door groaned open, and I stepped into a single large room. Dust clung to everything. A fireplace full of bird nests, a sagging table, 2 rickety chairs, and a moth-eaten mattress on a wooden frame. It smelled like wood rot and dead leaves. I got to work the next morning. My plan was to clean out the inside, set up a basic workstation, and then climb up on the roof to patch what I could. I didn't mind the isolation. In fact, I liked it. The nearest house was probably a mile away, and you couldn't hear a car or voice. Just whine through the trees and the occasional fox barking at night. The days were quiet. I'd wake up with the sun, make tea on my little stove, then spend hours pulling down rotten beams or carrying up materials I'd left near the car. The nights were cold and pitch black. I'd use a headlamp and candles. The quiet took a little getting used to, but I didn't mind. I slept lightly, though. The old stone walls amplified every creak. About a week in, I started noticing small things. One night, I heard what sounded like leaves crunching outside, like footsteps circling the cabin. I sat still and listened. Nothing. I figured it was a deer or badger. But in the morning, I saw faint prints outside the door. Not boots, bare feet, just the ball and heel narrow and light, almost like a child's. I stared at them for a while. The ground was damp, so they weren't fresh, maybe a day old. Still, it was strange. The cabin was off any known trail, and the closest property was way down the hill. A few days later, I went to check the tools I'd left under a tarp beside the cabin. A hammer was missing. I searched all around and even retraced my steps, thinking I'd misplaced it during work. Nothing. The next day, it was back, sitting on the table inside, covered in damp soil. I know I didn't bring it in. That shook me a bit. The next night, I heard the crunching again, this time closer. I grabbed my headlamp and stepped outside. I swept the light across the trees. Nothing moved. But then I caught something, a figure, just behind a birch tree. She was tall, thin, wearing something pale. Her skin looked ashy in the light. She stood still like she was waiting. I didn't say anything, just stared. She didn't move. I backed into the cabin and shut the door, locked it, then sat down in the dark. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat with a hammer in my hand, listening. Morning came slow. I stepped outside. The woman was gone. No footprints, just the same damp moss and dirt. I told myself it was a hiker, maybe someone lost. But deep down, it didn't feel right. That day, I worked less. My mind kept going back to her. Her stillness. Her eyes, I didn't remember seeing them clearly. Just the shape of her face and the color of her skin. And her clothes, they looked like hospital gowns or something you'd see in an old photo. I kept the cabin locked after that. Every night, I brought the tools inside and checked the windows twice. But the noises didn't stop. Some nights, it was just the wind. Other nights, I heard knocking. Not loud, just a slow, almost hesitant tapping on the door. 3 knocks, then silence. I never opened it. I just sat there, holding whatever tool was closest, until the sound stopped. The worst night came about 2.5 weeks in. I just finished repairing a section of the roof and came inside for tea. I was tired, shoulders sore, hands blistered, and I sat down on the mattress for a moment. I must have dozed off. When I woke up, it was dark. My headlamp was off, and the candle had burned down. I heard breathing, not mine, slow, shallow, and close. I froze. My eyes adjusted, and I saw her, standing in the corner of the room, just standing, facing me. Her hands hung at her sides. Her face was blank, pale. Her eyes were fixed on mine, but she didn't move. I don't know how long we stayed like that. A minute, maybe more. I wanted to move but couldn't. Then, without sound, she turned and walked into the far wall, right where the old chimney was, just vanished behind it. I scrambled for my light, turned it on. The room was empty. The wall was solid. I checked the door, still locked. No broken windows, nothing disturbed. The next morning, I packed up what I could and left. I didn't tell the guy why. I just said something came up. I hiked back to my van and drove out of there. I didn't sleep right for weeks, but it didn't end there. 2 months later, I got a call from the same guy. He asked if I'd be willing to come back for a final round of work. He said the roof had collapsed on one side and wanted it rebuilt before winter. I told him no, but out of curiosity, I asked if he'd had anyone else up there since I left. He said no. No one had been up there since the day I walked away, but someone had broken in recently. When he went up to check, he found the cabin trashed, tools scattered, wood shavings across the floor, and something strange scratched into the inside of the front door. I asked what it said. He paused, then told me it was just 3 words. She lives here. He didn't know what it meant, thought it might have been vandals, but it didn't sound like vandalism to me. It sounded like a warning. I never went back. I quit freelance work the year after, moved south, took up a job in maintenance at a college. Safer work, fewer nights alone. But I still think about her sometimes. When the house creaks at night or when I'm walking alone and get the feeling someone's watching. It's not the image of her that stays with me. It's the way she moved, or didn't move, like she didn't breathe right, like she'd been out there for a long, long time. And the strangest part? I later found out that, back in the 1970s, that cabin belonged to a woman named Margaret Hensley. She lived alone, was known in the village as quiet, maybe a bit odd. One winter, she vanished. Search parties looked for days, never found her. Her name faded from memory and the cabin passed to her brother, then his son, the man who hired me. But no one ever said what happened in that cabin. No one knew if she'd left, died, or just disappeared. Now I think I know. She never left. She just waited, alone in the woods, behind the trees, at the edge of the candlelight, and I saw her. It was in late September of 2012 when I decided to take a break from everything. I was 35 back then, working a dead-end warehouse job in Sheffield, England. The hours were long and unpredictable, mostly night shifts, and the repetition of lifting boxes and logging numbers had started to blur the days together. My back ached every morning. My knees clicked every time I stood up. I didn't have anyone to come home to. I wasn't married. My parents were long gone. Friends, they drifted away with time like leaves in the wind. So I took 2 weeks off unpaid. I just told my manager I needed air and that was it. No one asked further questions, and that was probably the most depressing part. I rented a small cottage on the edge of Northumberland National Park. It was owned by some old farmer who listed it online. Looked rustic, secluded, no Wi-Fi, no phone signal, just what I wanted. I drove up on a rainy Friday. The rain wasn't heavy, but it had that constant, annoying drizzle that turned everything slick. The further north I drove, the more isolated everything became. Eventually, the paved roads gave way to narrow gravel trails surrounded by thick trees. By the time I reached the cottage, my small hatchback was covered in mud and pine needles. The farmer wasn't there. He had left a key under a ceramic frog by the back door, just like he said in the confirmation email. I went in, dropped my bag, made some tea on the gas stove, and just sat in silence for a while. That first night was peaceful. The only sounds were wind pushing through the trees and the occasional drip from the eaves. I read an old paperback novel I found on the shelf, then fell asleep early. The mattress was firm, a bit dusty, but I didn't care. I slept like a stone. The next morning, I took a long walk. The national park stretched in every direction. Miles of mossy trails, shallow creeks, ferns as tall as my waist. I walked for hours, not seeing a single person.
No hikers.
No cars. Nothing. That sense of space, of being totally alone, was refreshing at first. It felt like I could breathe for the first time in years. Around midday, I came across a narrow footpath that looked older than the others. It wasn't marked on the trail map I brought with me. It cut off from the main trail and dipped down into a denser part of the forest. It wasn't overgrown, just forgotten. The trees on either side grew close together, forming a kind of natural tunnel. The ground was soft, covered in fallen pine needles. Something about it drew me in. I followed it for maybe half an hour. The further I went, the darker it got. The canopy overhead thickened, and the sounds of the forest began to fade.
No birds. No insects.
Just wind and the crunch of my boots. That's when I saw it. The cabin. It was set back from the trail a bit, hidden behind a tangle of brambles and small oaks. It wasn't big, maybe 2 rooms max, but it was still standing. The roof was bowed in the middle, sagging under the weight of years of debris. The windows were either boarded up or too dirty to see through. The wood siding was dark with rot and age. No signs of recent activity.
No tire marks.
No paths leading to it. It looked like it had been dropped there and forgotten decades ago. I don't know what made me approach. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe I just wanted something interesting to break the monotony. I pushed through the undergrowth and stood on the front porch. The boards creaked beneath me. The air smelled like wet earth and decay. I pressed my hand against the door and gave it a push. It opened with a groan. Inside, it was dim but dry. The smell was stronger, mold, old wood, something faintly metallic. The front room was empty except for a broken table, a rusted oil lamp, and a few scattered papers. Most of them were water-damaged, unreadable. There was a fireplace on the far wall, blackened with soot but still intact. The floor was covered in leaves and rodent droppings. To my left was a doorway that led to a back room. I stepped in slowly, half expecting the floor to give out, but it held. The silence inside that cabin was heavy. Even my breathing felt too loud. I moved to the back room. It was smaller.
No windows.
There was an old metal bed frame in the corner and something bundled on top of it, under a stained tarp. I froze. My stomach tightened. I didn't want to lift it. My curiosity was thinning fast. But I told myself it was probably just trash or maybe old bedding. I reached out and pulled the tarp back. Underneath was a pile of clothes. Just clothes. Faded jeans, a flannel shirt, and what looked like a canvas rucksack. Everything smelled of mildew. I picked up the rucksack and opened it. Inside were some old tins of food, a cracked compass, and a small leather-bound notebook. I flipped through it. Most of the pages were smeared with moisture, but a few were legible. They were journal entries. The first few entries were about hunting. The man, his name might have been Cal or Carl, wrote about tracking deer and small game. He talked about the cabin like it was a retreat. But then the entries got off. He started mentioning noises outside the cabin at night. Said he'd hear footsteps crunching through the leaves. Once, he wrote that something scratched the wall near the fireplace while he was sleeping. He thought it was an animal at first, maybe a badger or a fox. But then the entries started sounding more paranoid. He talked about being watched, about waking up to find the front door open.
No footprints.
No tracks, just open. The last entry was short. Asterisk can't sleep. It's outside again. Don't know how it keeps finding me. Going to block the door. If I don't write again, something's happened. Asterisk, that was it. I closed the notebook and stood there for a long time. My thoughts were racing. I wasn't scared. Exactly. But I felt a deep unease settle over me like a damp blanket. I put the book back in the rucksack, set it down, and left the cabin. I didn't look back. Back at the cottage, I locked the door. I hadn't felt the need to lock it before. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the old beams, every gust of wind against the window, made me sit up. I told myself it was just an old hunter's cabin. The man probably got spooked by a fox or something and left in a hurry. Nothing more. The next few days were quiet. I walked different trails, stuck to the marked paths, avoided the old footpath entirely. But it was always in the back of my mind. That cabin, that last journal entry, that feeling of being watched. I thought I was shaking it off until the fifth night. I woke up to a noise outside. It was just past 2 a.m. The rain had returned, tapping lightly against the roof. First, I thought it was a branch falling, but then I heard it again, a steady crunching sound, slow, deliberate steps moving around the side of the cottage. My blood went cold. I sat up in bed, heart thudding. I didn't move. The sound circled the cottage once, then again. I wanted to tell myself it was a deer or maybe a stray dog, but it sounded too human. Then nothing, just silence. Eventually, I got up and checked the windows. Nothing. I even stepped outside with a flashlight. The air was wet and still. No movement, no tracks in the mud, nothing to see. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I packed up early. I was supposed to have 3 more days, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to leave. On my way out, I passed the turnoff to that old footpath. I didn't stop. I didn't even look. Back home, I tried to move on. I went back to work, fell into the same routine. But I kept thinking about that cabin, about the journal, about the last few nights at the cottage. Sometimes, late at night, I'd wake up and swear I heard something outside my window, just for a second. Then it'd be gone. A few months later, I looked up old records from the area. There wasn't much. The national park was full of abandoned buildings, old gamekeeper lodges, forestry stations, cottages lost to time. No one kept track of them. The name Cal or Carl never turned up in any missing persons reports that I could find. It was like he'd vanished without anyone noticing. I still think about that cabin sometimes. I wonder how long it had been empty. I wonder who built it. And I wonder what exactly he thought was outside his door at night. The rational part of my brain says it was just isolation getting to him. Cabin fever, imagination. But the feeling I had when I stood in that room, reading that last entry, it was real. I haven't been back to Northumberland since. I haven't camped or hiked alone either. Something about that trip changed how I see the woods, how I hear certain sounds at night. Maybe nothing ever happened there. Maybe it was just a man scaring himself to death in the dark. Or maybe, just maybe, he wasn't wrong, and I was lucky to walk away. It was a chilly evening, and I was driving back from a long day of work, the kind of day where every moment seemed to drag, where the monotonous ticking of the clock felt like an endless reminder of time passing too slowly. As I drove, I found myself on the same winding country roads I knew all too well. The rain had just started to fall lightly, painting the world with a thin layer of mist. I wasn't in a hurry. I didn't have anywhere pressing to be. But for some reason, when I reached the turnoff that would take me past my ex-husband's cabin, I hesitated. It wasn't a conscious decision, it just happened. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as the familiar landmark came into view. The cabin had been his place, his retreat from everything. I used to spend weekends there, back when we were still together. before everything fell apart. It had been years since I had last seen the cabin, years since we had been in touch. But as I approached it, I could feel the knot in my stomach tighten. I had never thought of it as mine, but I couldn't deny the strange connection it had with my past. The memories of weekends spent in that cabin, talking by the fire, sharing quiet moments. Those were memories that belonged to another time, a time that no longer existed. As I drove past, the headlights of my car briefly illuminated the cabin through the rain-soaked trees. The lights inside were off, the windows were dark, and yet something felt off. There was a presence about the place that made my skin prickle. My heart beat faster for reasons I couldn't explain. I told myself it was just the feeling of nostalgia creeping in, nothing more. But as I continued down the road, I felt a sudden urge to turn back, to stop and look at it for just a moment longer. Something wasn't sitting right with me. I couldn't explain it, but I had to see it again. I told myself I was being silly, but the thought of driving away without going back felt wrong. I made the turn around the bend, and the headlights flashed over the cabin again. This time, I pulled off the road, parking my car a little further down the dirt track. The rain had picked up now, hitting the roof of the car with a steady rhythm. The cabin was just a few hundred feet away, nestled between trees, hidden in the mist. I stayed there for a moment, staring at the place, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quite put together. It wasn't as though I was looking for closure. I'd gotten past that, but something in me needed to take a step back into that part of my life, even if it meant revisiting the hurt. I stepped out of the car and pulled my coat tightly around me, the cold rain soaking through within seconds. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I walked closer to the cabin. The closer I got, the heavier the silence felt. The air seemed thick with something unspoken. As I approached the porch, I looked up at the cabin's weathered exterior, the wood now worn with age. It had been years, but it still felt oddly familiar. I stopped at the base of the steps, unsure of what I was hoping to find. Part of me wanted to leave, just get back in the car and forget about the whole thing. But the other part of me was drawn in like a moth to a flame. I climbed the steps slowly, my fingers grazing the railing, which felt colder than I remembered. The front door was slightly ajar. I froze. The door should have been locked. No one had lived here in ages, certainly not since my ex had moved out. He hadn't even been in touch for months before we split up. I was sure he hadn't been back here, so why was the door open? My stomach churned, and for a moment, I thought about turning back, but curiosity pushed me forward. I stepped inside. The smell hit me first. It wasn't the smell of mildew or rot. It was a familiar, musky odor, one I hadn't noticed back when we used to spend time here. It wasn't unpleasant, but it made my skin crawl just a bit. I stepped further into the room, my boots muffled against the old wooden floor. The living room looked unchanged. The furniture was still in place, the old armchair by the fireplace, the worn rug that used to feel so soft. The firewood sat in its usual place, untouched, as though no one had been here in years. But something was different. The air was heavy with a kind of oppressive stillness. As I looked around, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Even though I knew no one else was there, I glanced toward the kitchen. The faint sound of something, what I couldn't tell, came from that direction. It wasn't a noise I recognized. A soft scrape against metal, almost like someone dragging something heavy. I stood there for a moment, my pulse quickening. I knew I should leave. It wasn't safe to be here. I didn't belong here, but something inside me said I needed to see it through whatever it was. I walked toward the kitchen, my footsteps sounding too loud in the otherwise quiet cabin. The door to the kitchen was open, just like the front door, but as I reached it, I stopped dead in my tracks. A figure stood in the corner of the room. I froze, my heart pounding. I hadn't seen anyone walk in, no sound of a door opening or closing. But there, in the dim light, a figure stood motionless by the counter. The air in the room felt suddenly colder. The figure didn't move. It didn't even acknowledge my presence. And that's when I realized there was no need to acknowledge me. It wasn't a person at all. It was a mannequin. I exhaled sharply, feeling my heart rate slow as the initial shock wore off. The mannequin stood there, dressed in a tattered coat and old boots. Its face was obscured by a scarf tied around its neck, but its posture was eerily lifelike. The mannequin looked like something straight out of a horror movie, but as I stepped closer, I could see it was just a strange piece of decor. Relief washed over me, but only for a moment. I turned to leave, but as I did, I noticed something else. A small set of keys on the counter beside the mannequin. They weren't mine. I would have recognized them. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside the cabin. I stood frozen, my breath shallow. Someone was out there. It wasn't my ex-husband. He would never leave keys out like that, not if he hadn't been back in years. And I would have known if someone had been living here. I turned back toward the door. The footsteps grew louder. Without thinking, I dashed into the nearest bedroom, shutting the door behind me as quietly as possible. My heart raced as I pressed my back against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. Through the cracks in the door, I saw shadows moving outside. Whoever it was didn't seem to notice the cabin door was ajar. The footsteps stopped near the front door, and for a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the door creaked open. I didn't dare make a sound. The adrenaline pulsed through my veins, and my mind raced. What was I supposed to do now? Who was this person? What did they want? I had to think, fast. From the corner of the room, I spotted a small window, barely wide enough for a person to slip through. My heart hammered as I weighed the decision. There was no way I was going out that way, but maybe, just maybe, I could reach the front door if I moved quietly enough. The sound of someone walking through the living room made my decision for me. I waited, counting the seconds in my head as the footsteps drew closer. My escape plan was clear now. I had no other choice. I waited until the person passed my door, and then, with a deep breath, I opened the window. I crawled out as silently as I could, my boots scraping the frame. Outside, the rain had picked up again, drenching me in seconds. But I didn't care. I ran. I ran until I could no longer hear the footsteps behind me, until I was sure no one was chasing me. When I finally reached my car, I didn't stop to think. I started the engine, slammed the door shut, and drove off into the night, the rain pelting the windshield as if trying to wash away everything that had just happened. I didn't look back, and when I finally got home, I locked every door and every window. I didn't turn off the lights until the morning. It wasn't until the next day that I realized the mannequin was still there. The keys had never been touched. But the thing that bothered me most, the thing that made me shiver just thinking about it, was that the front door had been locked again. And I hadn't locked it. The mystery of that night, the unanswered questions, still linger. But one thing was certain, I would never go back to that cabin again. It was early November, just as the cold bite of winter started to creep into the mountains. The kind of cold that makes your breath visible, even in the middle of the day. I'd been hunting with my Uncle Jack for as long as I could remember. This was supposed to be another one of those trips. Nothing special, just a weekend hunt in the hills around our family cabin. The cabin itself wasn't much. It had been in the family for generations. My great-grandfather had built it with his bare hands, and it had seen a lot of history. It wasn't luxurious by any means. Just a one-room wooden structure with a few beds, a stone fireplace, and an old kitchen table that had seen better days. But it was quiet, tucked away in the woods, far from any other signs of civilization. That's why we loved it. Jack and I had been up since before dawn. The air was crisp, and the sun hadn't yet made its full appearance over the ridge. We were heading out to track some deer, a typical hunt for this time of year. But as we made our way deeper into the forest, things felt different. The trees looked older, more dense, and the further we went, the more the sense of isolation settled over me. "I think the deer are over that way," Jack said, pointing toward a thicket of trees that I hadn't noticed before. I nodded, though something about the direction he pointed to didn't sit right. Felt like we were pushing into territory we shouldn't be in. The ground was soft underfoot, and the leaves crunched beneath our boots. The trail was difficult to follow, with patches of thick underbrush and the occasional rock or fallen tree. I kept my eyes peeled, trying to stay focused. Jack was ahead, moving at a steady pace, his years of experience in the woods showing. He didn't seem to notice anything off, but I felt an odd tension in the air. We walked for what felt like hours. The silence was absolute, save for the occasional distant sound of a bird or rustling in the brush. But there was something else, too. The deeper we went, the more I felt like we weren't alone. It wasn't a presence that was easily explained. It was just a feeling, the kind you get when you're in a place that's too quiet, too still. After some time, Jack stopped and crouched down, signaling me to do the same. We were near a small clearing, and he pointed to the ground where I could make out fresh tracks. Deer prints, but they were old, possibly from the night before. "Let's circle around, try to get ahead of them," Jack whispered, his voice low. We moved in a wide arc, careful not to make any noise. The trees here were thick, their branches heavy with the weight of fallen leaves, making it harder to see clearly. I kept close to Jack, my rifle ready, eyes scanning every shadow, every movement. We reached the edge of a small ravine, and Jack motioned for me to stop. He peered down into the drop, scanning the other side. Something caught his eye, and he stood up straighter, hand gripping his rifle tighter. "I thought I saw movement," he muttered. "Stay low. Let's move." We crouched down and began to move toward the edge of the ravine. As we did, I felt the strange feeling again, the sense that something was watching us, like eyes were trained on our every move. It was unsettling, to say the least. We reached the bottom of the ravine, and I glanced up at Jack. His face was tense, his eyes narrowed in concentration. We moved slowly, carefully toward the other side, and that's when I saw it. A flash of something large moving just beyond a line of trees. "Stay close," Jack whispered again, his voice barely audible over the wind. We moved swiftly now, cutting across the ravine and climbing up the other side. As we crested the ridge, the wind picked up, pushing the smell of pine and damp earth into my nose. It was then that I heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost like a grunt, coming from just ahead. Jack stopped in his tracks, his head snapping toward the sound. His eyes widened slightly. "What the hell?" We moved closer, cautiously, trying not to make a sound. As we rounded a bend in the trees, we stopped dead in our tracks. There, standing in the middle of the clearing, was a massive creature. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. It was huge, its fur matted and dark, its body hunched in a way that looked unnatural. It had the shape of something like a bear, but its legs were too long, its body too slim. And the eyes, there was something wrong with the eyes. They were wide and glowing, like they were reflecting the light in a way that wasn't normal. I could feel my heart race in my chest. It was like every instinct in my body told me to run, but my legs felt like they were frozen in place. "Jack?" I whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady. "What the hell is that?" Jack didn't answer at first. His grip tightened on his rifle, and he took a slow step back. That's when the creature turned its head toward us, its eyes locking onto ours. My blood ran cold. The thing let out a low, rumbling growl, and I saw its teeth, sharp, jagged things that looked like they could tear through bone. Then, in a flash, it lunged. I barely had time to react. Jack fired his rifle, but the shot missed, sending a shock of sound into the air. The creature didn't slow down. It was on us in an instant, moving faster than I thought something that big could. I felt the force of it as it slammed into Jack, knocking him to the ground. His rifle flew from his hands, landing several feet away. The creature snarled, its mouth open wide, and I saw its claws, long, razor-sharp, and glinting in the light. "Jack!" I shouted, but my voice was lost in the chaos. I raised my rifle, but I couldn't get a clear shot. Without thinking, I ran. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I bolted. I knew I wasn't going to outrun the thing, but I didn't know what else to do. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could hear the creature chasing me, its heavy footsteps thundering behind me. I glanced over my shoulder once, and that's when I saw it. A massive shape, closing the gap between us. I pushed myself harder, desperate to get to safety. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I reached the edge of the woods. The trees thinned out, and I could see the cabin in the distance. I forced myself to keep going, my legs burning, my breath ragged. I could hear the creature's growls growing louder. I made it to the cabin, bursting through the door and slamming it shut behind me. I didn't care about the noise I'd made. I just needed to get inside. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the lock. The creature wasn't far behind. I knew that much. I could hear its growls and the thud of its footsteps getting closer. But as I locked the door, I realized something. The sound of its steps had stopped. The growling had faded. I waited, heart in my throat. I stood still, listening. And then, nothing. Silence. Minutes passed, maybe longer, but I didn't dare move. The room was pitch black, the only sound my own breathing, heavy and ragged. I felt my way to the window, careful not to make a sound, and peeked outside. There was nothing, no sign of the creature. I exhaled, the weight of the situation sinking in. What had just happened? I didn't know. But one thing was certain, the woods weren't the same. Something had changed. Something out there had shifted, and I wasn't sure what, but I was damn sure I wasn't going back into those woods without answers. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I sat by the fire, listening to the wind howl outside, and kept my rifle close. Jack was gone. I didn't know what had happened to him, but I couldn't bring myself to go out and look. I never did find out what that thing was. Some nights, I can still hear it in my head. The low growl, the sound of it moving through the trees. I can still see its eyes, glowing in the dark, staring at me. The next morning, I packed up and left the cabin. The memories of that night lingering in my mind like a shadow I couldn't escape. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway. A few days to myself in a cabin up in the northern woods of Wisconsin. The idea was simple. No work, no distractions, just peace and quiet. I needed it. My job had been stressful. I'd been going through a rough patch personally, and I was desperate to clear my head. The kind of quiet that comes from being far away from everything. Deep in the woods, surrounded only by trees and the sounds of nature. I'd rented the cabin from a small, family-owned place near the town of Ely. The owner, a middle-aged man named Roy, had been friendly when I called. He explained that the cabin was off the grid. No electricity, no phone signal, just a wood stove for heat, candles for light, and an old-fashioned hand pump for water. The perfect place to escape everything. I arrived in the late afternoon, the air cool with that crisp, autumn bite. The long dirt road leading to the cabin was narrow, winding, and lined with dense trees that looked like something out of an old horror movie. I parked my car a few hundred yards from the cabin and grabbed my bags, feeling the weight of the isolation starting to settle in. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the faint rustle of branches in the wind. The cabin was small but charming. It had a rugged exterior, built from rough-hewn logs, the kind you'd see in old Western movies. A porch stretched around the front, and inside it was cozy bare except for the essentials. A wooden table, a couple of chairs, a fireplace with a few logs stacked nearby, and an old leather armchair by the window. The walls were lined with hunting trophies, deer antlers, and old maps. It had a well-worn, lived-in feel that made it feel welcoming despite the eerie quiet that surrounded it. I spent the first hour or so unpacking, getting things settled. I lit a fire in the stove, made myself some coffee, and took a seat in the armchair, gazing out the window at the trees swaying in the breeze. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that felt almost unnatural. There wasn't a sound for miles. No birds, no animals, not even the distant hum of a passing car. Just the stillness. After a while, I decided to take a walk. I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door, locking it behind me. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the sky. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet. I walked along the small trail near the cabin, breathing in the cool, fresh air. It wasn't long before the path started to fade, and I realized I had wandered deeper than I intended. The trail was barely visible now, and the dense trees around me made it hard to tell where I was. I stood still for a moment, trying to get my bearings. The silence pressed in on me, thick and heavy. Then I heard it, a faint sound, a snap of a twig. I froze, listening. The wind had died down, so I could hear clearly now. It came again, a crunch of leaves underfoot. Someone or something was nearby. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer, but a small voice at the back of my mind whispered that it wasn't. It was too deliberate, too intentional. I decided to head back to the cabin, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. I quickened my pace, my eyes scanning the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. I made it back to the cabin just as the sun disappeared completely, leaving only the dim glow of twilight. I locked the door behind me and threw the deadbolt, feeling a strange unease settle in my stomach. The house was still and quiet, but it didn't feel as welcoming anymore. I stoked the fire, trying to shake off the feeling of dread creeping in. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The cabin creaked and groaned, as cabins often do when the wind shifts, but I couldn't ignore the sense that something was off. I heard another noise, a thud, coming from outside. I told myself it was an animal again, maybe a bear or a raccoon, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was too close, too deliberate. I lay there, staring into the dark, wide awake. Then, another noise, this time a tap on the window. I shot up in bed, my heart racing. I hadn't heard anything approach the cabin. No footsteps, no rustling in the bushes, nothing. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and shone it toward the window. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing out there. The trees were still, the snow-covered ground undisturbed. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. I was just being paranoid. It was just the isolation getting to me. I turned off the flashlight and lay back down, pulling the covers up to my chin. But I couldn't sleep. Every little sound, the crackling of the fire, the wind against the walls, kept me on edge. I kept imagining shadows moving just outside my window, things lurking just beyond the reach of the light. Around 2 a.m., I finally drifted off into a restless sleep. The next day, I decided to stick to the cabin and relax. I spent the morning reading, making some breakfast, and just trying to shake the unsettling feelings that had been with me since I arrived. But the strange occurrences kept happening. I'd hear footsteps outside, soft, slow steps, just out of sight. I'd hear branches scraping against the cabin, but when I went outside to check, there was nothing there. By the time evening rolled around, I was on edge. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling of being watched was getting stronger. The sounds outside were becoming more frequent. Scraping, tapping, the sound of something moving in the woods. I decided to leave the cabin for a while to take a drive into town. I needed a break from the tension that seemed to be suffocating me. I locked up the cabin and headed down the road, my headlights cutting through the dark. The town was only about 20 minutes away, but I didn't take my time getting there. I felt an urgency to be away from that cabin, from whatever was out there. I grabbed a coffee from the small diner in town and sat at a table trying to relax. But my mind kept drifting back to the cabin. I couldn't stop thinking about the noises, the feeling that something wasn't right, someone was out there. I spent a couple of hours in town, just trying to clear my head, but I knew I couldn't stay away forever. The moment I got back to the cabin, the sense of unease hit me again, like a wave. But I pushed through it, telling myself that I had overreacted. There was nothing out there, just the woods, the wind, and my own imagination. I spent the next few days trying to make the best of the situation. I went for hikes, chopped firewood, cooked meals, anything to distract myself. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. The tapping, the rustling, the occasional glimpse of movement at the edge of my vision. It was like something was following me, but I couldn't catch it. Every time I went outside, the woods seemed to close in around me, darker and more oppressive. On the fourth night, I decided to leave. I packed up my things, ready to head back to civilization, to get away from the strange feeling that had been hanging over me. As I started the car and backed out of the driveway, I looked at the cabin one last time. For a moment, I thought I saw something in the window, a figure, standing still. But when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't stop to check. I drove all the way back to town, not once looking back. The cabin was still behind me, but I had no intention of ever going back. As I left the woods behind, I realized one thing. Whatever it was that had been watching me wasn't some figment of my imagination. It was real. And as I thought about the cabin, the trees, the sounds in the night, I knew that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than just a spooky cabin in the woods. Something was out there, and it wasn't going away. I never went back. And to this day, I can't help but wonder what was really out there. But I know one thing for sure, whatever it was, it didn't want me there. And I wasn't about to find out what would have happened if I had stayed any longer. It had been a long drive, the kind where you barely notice the hours passing because the monotony of the road, the lack of any real human presence, puts you in a daze. I was 27, alone, and searching for some time away from my busy life. Maybe I was running from something I couldn't quite define. Stress, a breakup, the weight of expectations from people around me. Whatever it was, this cabin was supposed to help me forget, to let me breathe for a few days. It was located deep in the Northwoods of Michigan, tucked away from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but dense trees and rough terrain. My uncle, Greg, had told me about it when I was younger, how it was his getaway, his hideaway from everything. He passed away 2 years ago, leaving the cabin to me. I didn't even know if it was still in good condition, but I figured I'd find out soon enough. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky overcast, heavy clouds hanging low. It was that strange kind of quiet, no birds, no sounds of any animals, just the rustle of the wind in the trees. The cabin stood there, just as my uncle had described it, old, creaky, but solid. The wood was weathered and worn, with patches of moss growing on the sides, but it still looked sturdy enough. I opened the door with a creak and stepped inside, the familiar musty smell of old wood and mildew filling the air. The space was small, a one-room cabin with a loft where the bed was. The main room had a fireplace, a couple of chairs, a table, and a set of old bookshelves filled with dust-covered books. It looked untouched, almost like time had frozen in that place, and I thought for a moment that maybe I wasn't the first one to visit after my uncle's death. I dropped my duffel bag by the door, setting up a fire in the hearth. The logs cracked and popped, and the warmth spread throughout the room. I unpacked a few things, pulled out a blanket, and sank into one of the chairs by the fire. There was nothing else to do. The evening was creeping in, and the wind outside was picking up, howling through the trees. It was the kind of night where the darkness seemed to swallow everything. I was fine with that, though. I liked the isolation. It was peaceful. I remember feeling a strange sense of calmness. It was almost like the forest was holding me in its grasp, making me forget about the world I'd left behind. But that peace didn't last long. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the wind picked up even more. The house groaned under the pressure. The fire was blazing now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the cabin settling, the wind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I couldn't help but feel watched. The first noise I heard wasn't natural. It was a thud, slow, deliberate. I sat up straighter in my chair, eyes darting toward the window. My heart raced, but I told myself it was probably just an animal. I had heard plenty of animals in the woods before. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. But this sound, it was too rhythmic, too intentional to be from an animal. I stood and grabbed the flashlight from the table, stepping quietly to the door. I cracked it open a sliver, shining the light into the yard. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. I felt foolish for even considering something was out there. There was nothing but forest and shadows. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that crawled up my spine. The thud had stopped. Whatever it was had gone silent. I closed the door, double-locking it, but I left the chain undone, just in case. I spent the next few hours sitting by the fire, trying to convince myself that the quiet had returned. But my mind kept drifting to that sound, kept playing on a loop in my head, like it was warning me. At around midnight, I heard it again. This time, closer. The thud echoed through the cabin, and this time it wasn't a single thud. It was followed by a dragging sound, as if someone or something was moving through the forest just outside the cabin walls. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't normal. This wasn't an animal. I grabbed my phone, but the signal was weak out here. I had no way of calling anyone, and the realization hit me that I was completely alone. There was no one to help if something went wrong. The thought made my pulse race even faster. I decided to check the windows. Slowly, carefully, I approached each one, peering out into the darkness. The light from the fire illuminated the walls but couldn't reach far enough into the yard. I saw nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. I went back to the door, locked it again, and stepped toward the back room, which had a small closet. Maybe I could hide something in there, just in case. I was about to grab my jacket when I heard the creak of the floorboards behind me. It was faint but unmistakable. Someone was in the cabin with me. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing. Nothing but the shadows in the corners of the room. Then I heard a voice, but not a voice I could recognize. It was low, guttural, like someone was trying to whisper but couldn't quite manage it. The sound seemed to come from all around me, surrounding me, invading my senses. It was like the air itself was closing in on me, smothering me. I bolted for the door, my feet pounding against the floor as I grabbed the handle. But just as I touched it, I heard a loud bang from outside. The door rattled on its hinges, as if something had slammed against it from the other side. My stomach twisted in fear. Then, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone breathing heavily just outside the door. I froze. Suddenly, the door rattled again, followed by another bang, this one harder than the last. It was as if whatever was outside was testing the strength of the door, trying to force its way in. Panic shot through me. This wasn't just a person, I could feel it. This was someone dangerous, someone who wanted something from me, and they weren't going to stop until they got it. I moved quietly, grabbing whatever I could find to use as a weapon. I picked up a metal fireplace poker, my hands shaking as I held it in front of me. I had no idea what to expect, but I knew one thing. I needed to stay alive. The thudding from outside stopped. The silence was deafening. I crept closer to the door, pressing my ear against it. Then the handle turned. I didn't move. I just waited. The door creaked open a few inches, but something wasn't right. The wind had stopped, and the air felt wrong. I heard a low chuckle, sent a chill down my spine. Then the door opened fully, and I saw him. The man was tall, wearing a dark coat, his face shadowed beneath the brim of a hat. His eyes were wide, too wide, like he was studying me, trying to figure out what I was going to do next. His hands were steady, but his breath was erratic, like he was excited. I gripped the poker tightly, ready to defend myself. But as he stepped closer, I realized there was nowhere to run. The cabin had no back door. There was no escape. He tilted his head as if studying me like some kind of specimen, and then, as if realizing something, his expression changed. It wasn't amusement anymore. It was anger. "I knew you'd be trouble," he muttered, stepping even closer. The seconds stretched on as I held my breath. Then, in one swift motion, I swung the poker at him, the metal connecting with his head with a sickening thud. He staggered back, but I didn't stop. I swung again, this time catching him in the side. He dropped to the floor with a grunt, his body going limp. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the sound of his breathing slow, and finally stop. The forest outside was silent now, the wind having settled, as if it too was holding its breath. I stared at the man's lifeless body, my hands still shaking as I let the poker drop to the floor. I couldn't say how long I stood there, but eventually, I mustered the strength to leave the cabin. The wind picked up again as I stepped outside, my breath misting in the cool night air. I didn't know what had brought that man here or why he'd been watching me, but I knew one thing. I wasn't staying another minute. As I walked away from the cabin, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I looked down and saw a message from a friend. "You good? Haven't heard from you in a while." It felt strange to read that, as if the world had kept moving while I was caught in a nightmare. I never returned to that cabin. The forest swallowed it whole, just like it had swallowed everything else. Whatever had been out there was gone now, and I was too far away to care. But I'd never forget the feeling of being hunted, and I'd never forget the night the quiet forest turned into a trap. It was a quiet evening when I decided to head out to the cabin. A few days of solitude sounded like exactly what I needed, especially after the craziness of work. The place I rented was in a remote corner of Oregon, deep in the woods. There was no cell service, no internet, just me and the forest. The drive up was long, and the weather was starting to turn, the heavy clouds rolling in as if the sky had been waiting for me to arrive. I'd always wanted to experience a quiet, rainy night alone in the woods, just a simple life with nothing but the sound of raindrops tapping against the cabin windows. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the rain had already started. I could hear the soft rumble of thunder in the distance, and the air had that cool, fresh scent that only comes before a downpour. The cabin itself wasn't much, just a small wooden structure that looked like it belonged to another era. There were vines creeping up the sides, moss clinging to the roof, and the front porch had a few chairs that looked weathered from years of exposure. Despite its age, the cabin had a certain charm to it. It seemed to invite me in, promising the peace and quiet I was seeking. I grabbed my bag from the back of my car and walked up the porch steps. The door creaked open easily, and I stepped inside, greeted by the faint smell of old wood and firewood. The place was sparsely furnished. A couch sat against one wall, covered with a thick, plaid blanket. A small kitchen was off to the side, and the stove looked like it hadn't been used in a long time, though the firewood stacked in the corner suggested otherwise. The whole cabin had that lived-in feel, like someone had used it for years but hadn't bothered to clean it in quite some time. It was perfect. The rain started to pick up, drumming harder against the roof. I put my bag down and set about making a fire in the small fireplace. The wood crackled as the flames caught, and soon the cabin was filled with the warm glow of the fire. I opened a bottle of wine I had brought with me and settled into the armchair near the hearth, watching the rain pour outside. That's when I noticed something odd. A faint sound, almost like a knock. At first, I thought it might be the rain hitting the window. The storm was intense, and the wind was making the trees sway, causing them to creak and groan. But then I heard it again. A distinct, deliberate knock came from the back door. I sat up, my heart skipping a beat. There was no one around for miles. The nearest neighbor was a good 2 miles away, and there hadn't been any sign of anyone else as I drove up. I stood up slowly, walking toward the door, my mind racing. I knew I was being paranoid. It was just the storm, maybe the wind pushing the door against the frame. But something told me it wasn't the wind. The knock came again, louder this time. I stood frozen for a moment. My mind was trying to reason with the fear bubbling up in my chest. Could be nothing. It had to be nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter and walked carefully to the back door. The rain had picked up even more, the sound of it crashing against the roof and the ground nearly deafening. I peered out through the small window in the door, scanning the darkness. There was nothing out there, just the rain and the trees swaying in the wind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I hesitated for a moment before deciding to open the door and step outside. The cold air hit me instantly, and I wrapped my arms around myself for warmth. I shone the flashlight around, looking for any signs of movement in the darkness. Nothing. The woods were still and silent, save for the storm. It was hard to see anything beyond the reach of the flashlight beam, and I began to feel foolish for even stepping out. I was about to turn back when I heard it. A noise from the woods. It was faint at first, like a rustling in the bushes. Then came a snap of a branch. It was too deliberate to be an animal. Someone was out there. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen for a moment, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Whoever it was, they weren't making any effort to hide. I could hear them moving, but it wasn't the hurried, frantic movement of someone trying to sneak away. No, this was slow, deliberate, almost like they were waiting for me to react. The beam of my flashlight flickered as I tried to steady my hand. My mind raced through a million possibilities, none of them good. The isolation of the cabin, the storm, the knock on the door. It all suddenly felt wrong. I turned back to the cabin, my heart pounding. I had to get inside. As I stepped back toward the door, I heard the rustling again, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps crunching against the wet ground. I rushed inside, slamming the door shut behind me, and locked it with trembling hands. My heart was racing, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me. I leaned against the door, listening intently. The rain was still coming down in sheets, but I could hear the footsteps outside, now slow and deliberate. They were circling the cabin. I moved quickly to the window, peering through the blinds. The The flashlight beam had disappeared, but the figure was still out there, just beyond the reach of the rain. I couldn't make out any details, but I could see the shape of a man moving steadily through the trees. A chill ran through me. What the hell was he doing out there? I backed away from the window, my mind spinning. Whoever it was, they weren't here for anything good. I knew I needed to stay calm. The cabin was secure, locked doors, windows, and a fireplace. I wasn't defenseless, but I also knew the isolation meant no one could help me if things went wrong. The man outside didn't move. He just stood there, hidden in the trees, waiting. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel the weight of his presence like a heavy shadow pressing against the cabin walls. I grabbed my phone, hoping to make a call. Maybe I was being paranoid, but I wasn't taking any chances. But when I checked, the signal was still dead. The storm had knocked out any chance of contacting anyone. I was completely alone. The man started walking again, his footsteps dragging through the mud, like he was coming closer. I retreated into the kitchen, grabbing a knife from the drawer and holding it tightly in my hand. Felt stupid, but it was the only thing I had. The sound of his footsteps grew louder, closer to the cabin now. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. I waited, my breath shallow. The silence was deafening. And then came the knock again. 3 sharp raps on the back door. I froze, the knife still clutched in my hand. Whoever it was wanted in. But why? Why knock if you were gonna break in anyway? I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, and my fingers gripped the handle of the knife so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The knock came again, and then another. The cabin was small, and I could feel the walls closing in on me. It was impossible to stay calm. My heart pounded so loudly that I thought it might give me away. I could hear my own breath echo in the silence. Suddenly, the front door rattled. Someone was trying to open it. I backed away into the shadows, clutching the knife. The door shook again. It felt like time had frozen, and all I could do was wait. The man was close, and I was alone, trapped in a cabin with no way out. The door rattled once more, then stopped. A silence filled the space between us. I could still hear the rain, the wind, the sound of my heart beating in my chest. And then nothing.
No footsteps. No knocks.
No sound. I waited for what felt like an eternity. I didn't dare move, unsure if the man was still out there, waiting for me to make a mistake. After what felt like hours, I finally dared to look through the window again. The storm had slowed, the wind had died down, and the woods were quiet once more. The figure had disappeared. With trembling hands, I unlatched the door and stepped outside, cautiously scanning the area. The woods were still. The only sounds the distant murmur of the storm and the drip of water from the trees. I don't know how long I stood there, just trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But deep down, I knew. Whoever that man was, he hadn't gone far. I spent the night with every light on, every door locked. By morning, the storm had cleared, and the silence of the woods returned, but the tension never fully left. I didn't stay much longer than I had to. The cabin wasn't a refuge anymore. It was a reminder that sometimes solitude in the woods isn't as peaceful as it seems. When I left, I didn't look back. And as I drove down that winding road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one who had left the cabin that night. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, a break from the noise of the city, a retreat into the woods. Just me, my cousin Thomas, his wife Claire, and her stepsister Rachel. The cabin was tucked away in the thick forest of a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains, a place where the phone signal barely reached, and the closest town was miles away. The perfect place to disconnect and spend a few days away from the hustle. The sun had set hours ago, and the wind had started picking up as we settled into the cabin. The old wood creaked and groaned with every gust. The house wasn't much, just a small, one-room cabin with a fireplace, a couple of couches, and a table in the center. We all crowded around the fire, and the warmth of the flames was comforting against the chill that had begun to creep into the air. Rachel, the younger of the two sisters, had always been a bit of an outsider. She was quieter, more reserved, but in a way that was different from how some people might describe shyness. It was as if she always carried something with her, something unspoken. It wasn't that she was difficult to be around, but she often seemed distant, like her mind was somewhere else. Thomas, on the other hand, was as friendly as they come. He'd always been the type to keep the conversation going, keep things light, and make everyone feel at ease. Claire, his wife, was the perfect balance. Practical, calm, and sensible. She made sure everyone had what they needed and that nothing got out of hand. That first night, as we sat around the fire, the conversation was light. We shared stories from the past, talked about life back home, and laughed about the stupid things we had done as kids. It was comforting in a way, the kind of conversation that makes you forget the world outside, if only for a while. But as the hours wore on, something began to change. It started with the noises. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on the cabin, but there was something else. A faint scratching sound, followed by something like the gentle thump of footsteps. At first, we all shrugged it off as just the house settling. But then the scratching came again, louder this time, and this time it seemed to be coming from outside. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, moving around in the underbrush. But there was something unsettling about the sound. It didn't feel natural, not like any animal I'd ever heard. It was rhythmic, like someone was pacing back and forth, just out of sight. Thomas and Claire didn't seem to notice at first. Rachel, however, had a different look on her face. She was staring out the window, her eyes wide. I followed her gaze, but saw nothing in the darkness beyond the cabin. "I'm sure it's nothing," I said, trying to break the tension. "Just the wind, maybe a squirrel or something." But Rachel didn't look convinced. She got up abruptly and walked toward the door. "I'll check outside," she said, her voice sharp. "Rachel, don't be stupid," Claire said, but her tone was more tired than anything. "It's dark out there, and you don't know what's out there." Rachel didn't answer. She just opened the door and stepped outside. The door creaked closed behind her, and we all sat in silence, the sound of the fire crackling louder now in the sudden quiet. A few minutes passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then the door opened again. Rachel stepped back inside, her face pale. "There's nothing out there," she said, her voice tight. "But I swear, I heard someone walking around." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Did you see anyone?" I asked. "No," she replied quickly, too quickly. "I didn't see anything, but it felt like something was watching me." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Rachel, you've always been a little paranoid. You sure you're not just spooked?" "I don't know," Rachel said, her voice wavering, "but it felt real." We tried to brush it off, convinced that it was just the isolation of the place messing with our minds. It was easy to get paranoid when you were alone in a cabin in the middle of the woods, with no one else for miles. But despite our reassurances, the unease lingered in the air. That night, we all retired to our respective rooms. The cabin had a loft with a bed, and I took it while Thomas and Claire took the smaller bedroom downstairs. Rachel opted for the couch in the living room, her back to the fire. I tried to sleep, but the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. I couldn't get comfortable, and my mind kept racing back to the sounds we had heard earlier. The next morning, I woke up early to find the others already up. Rachel was nowhere to be seen. I figured she had gone out for a walk, but when I asked Thomas, he looked confused. "She didn't leave this morning," he said, glancing around the cabin. She's not in her room either. That's when the panic started to set in. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach as I realized that Rachel wasn't in the cabin anymore. It wasn't like her to disappear without saying anything. We searched the entire cabin, even checked the yard outside, but there was no sign of her. We called her name, but there was no answer. No one had seen her leave, and no one had heard anything. Hours passed. We searched further into the woods, calling her name, but it felt as if the trees were swallowing the sound. There was something wrong about the whole situation. Something wasn't adding up. By late afternoon, we were all on edge. We contacted the local authorities, but by the time they arrived, night had fallen. The search was difficult, and the forest was thick. As the hours stretched on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't just looking for Rachel anymore. The woods felt wrong. The air was dense, heavy with something unspoken. The next few days blurred together. We never found Rachel, and the police had no leads. The weather worsened, and the forest seemed to close in around us. We eventually had to leave the cabin, but as we drove away, I couldn't help but wonder, was Rachel ever really there? Had she just disappeared into the night, or had someone been out there with us the entire time? It had been a few years since I last visited the cabin. It wasn't much, just a small, weathered place tucked away on the edge of a quiet graveyard. I don't know why I'd agreed to return. Maybe it was the lure of solitude. Maybe it was the way the old memories seemed to be wrapped in layers of dust and silence that I could never quite forget. Or maybe it was simply the nagging feeling in the back of my mind that I needed to confront something I'd been running from for far too long. I'd heard all the rumors about the place, of course. People around here, especially the older folks, would mutter about strange happenings, things that didn't quite add up. They spoke of the graveyard as if it were alive with secrets, the cemetery itself a collection of whispered stories. They all said the same thing: don't go near that cabin. But for me, it wasn't the graveyard that haunted me. It was the cabin itself. It sat at the far end of the cemetery, behind the oldest rows of stones, where the ground dipped and twisted in ways that didn't seem natural. I always found it strange that such a place existed. How did it even get there? A cabin, built so close to the graves, separated by nothing more than a few old fences and overgrown bushes. It was like someone had designed it to be isolated from everything and everyone else. I remember the first time I saw the cabin. I was younger then, still a teenager, and my cousin had dared me to go there with him. We hadn't known much about it back then, just that it was old, abandoned, and supposedly haunted. We didn't believe in ghosts, though. What frightened us more was the isolation, the sense that this place, the cabin and the graveyard surrounding it, was a forgotten corner of the world. As soon as we stepped into the clearing, I felt a shift. Something about the place felt wrong, like a heavy weight pressing down on your chest. But I brushed it off. We spent the afternoon there, poking around, daring each other to step inside the cabin. We never did, not until the sun began to set. It was then that we noticed the strange things. The unmarked graves near the cabin, the sense of eyes watching from the darkness. That was when we ran. Years passed, and I couldn't escape the image of the cabin, nor the strange unease that still lingered in the back of my mind. Life moved on, but that place never left me. I wasn't sure why, but something about it drew me back, even though I had every reason to avoid it. I don't know what exactly pushed me to make the decision this time, to return to the cabin on a quiet weekend. Maybe it was the need to finally put those old fears to rest. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. But now that I was standing in front of it again, I realized that I hadn't come here to relive the past. I had come to face something I couldn't quite put into words. The air was colder than I remembered, and the silence was thick. I stood at the edge of the graveyard, watching the cabin, feeling a tug in my chest that I couldn't ignore. The place hadn't changed much. The cabin was still the same. Weathered wood, sagging roof, and broken windows. It looked abandoned, neglected. But then, I wasn't sure what I expected to find here. It had always been abandoned. The cemetery stretched out behind it, rows of graves in varying states of disrepair. Some were old, with weathered stones that seemed to have been forgotten by time, while others looked fresh, with flowers scattered over them as if someone still cared. The contrast made the whole place seem more unsettling, as if the cabin itself was stuck between two worlds, one of the living and one of the dead. I walked toward it slowly, my boots crunching on the dry ground. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees, but it did nothing to break the oppressive quiet. I tried not to think about how alone I was, how isolated this place felt. But the closer I got, the more uneasy I became. It wasn't just the cabin itself. It was the feeling that something had been here before me. Presence. Something old. Something that never quite left. When I finally reached the cabin, I paused for a moment, taking in the sight. The door hung open, just slightly, as though it had been waiting for someone to step inside. The air around it felt heavy, like the world itself was holding its breath. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest, and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty space inside. The air inside smelled stale, like mildew and dust. Sunlight filtered in through the broken windows, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. The place was exactly as I remembered. Empty, forsaken. The floor was covered in old newspapers, some of them yellowed with age, others torn and crumpled. The furniture was sparse, just a rickety old chair and a broken table. I walked deeper into the cabin, my footsteps cautious, my eyes scanning every corner. There was a chill in the air that seemed to seep into my bones. I moved to the far side of the room, where a small stone fireplace sat, cold and unused. The walls were bare, except for a few old, faded photographs hanging crookedly. But then I saw it, a small, rusted box sitting on the floor in the corner. At first, I thought it was just another piece of debris left behind. But as I walked closer, something about it caught my attention. It was too out of place, too deliberate. It had the look of something hidden, something left behind by someone who didn't want it to be found. My curiosity got the best of me, and I bent down to pick it up. The metal was cold to the touch, and when I lifted the lid, I was met with a pile of old, yellowing papers and a few small trinkets. I flipped through the papers slowly, carefully, until something caught my eye. It was a letter, faded but still legible. The letter was addressed to someone named Henry, but the signature was illegible. The contents were strange, cryptic. It spoke of debts owed, of promises broken, of things hidden deep beneath the surface. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. There was something wrong about this letter, something that felt dangerous, as though I had stumbled across something I was never meant to see. I didn't know what to make of it, so I stuffed it back into the box and closed the lid. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger, more oppressive. It was as though the very air in the room had thickened, as if the cabin itself were holding its breath, waiting for something. I stood up, glancing nervously around the room. The silence was unnerving now, the weight of it pressing down on me. I needed to leave. The cabin was never meant to be a place of comfort. It was a place of endings, a place where stories were buried and forgotten. I had no business being here. I stepped back toward the door, my eyes lingering on the shadows that seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally around me. I was almost at the door when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, a rustling, like footsteps on the ground behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but the cabin was empty. There was no one there, Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was watching me. Something had been here long before I arrived, and something was waiting for me to leave. I didn't hesitate any longer. I ran out of the cabin and back toward the cemetery, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't stop until I reached the gate, and even then, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The cabin stood there, silent, unmoving, but the feeling stayed with me. The unease, the sense that something had shifted, something had been uncovered that wasn't meant to be. I never went back to that cabin, and I don't think I ever will. Some places, some things are better left alone, buried in the past. The graveyard, the cabin, the letter, all of it is part of something I don't want to understand. I don't know who Henry was, or what debt he owed, or what he was running from. But I know this: that cabin, those graves, and whatever secrets they hold are not meant for me. And I am okay with that. I had been working as a park ranger in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan for a little over 6 months. The park was vast, stretching across miles of dense woods, hiking trails, and forgotten corners of land where few people ventured. Most of the time, I worked alongside a team, but tonight I was alone. The ranger cabin sat at the far edge of the park, an old structure built decades ago and barely updated since. The roof was slightly sagging, and the walls creaked with the wind. But it was home for the night, and it wasn't my first time staying here. It was a crisp autumn evening, just past dusk, with the air biting at my skin. The sky above was clear, the stars already starting to punctuate the darkening sky, but the wind had begun picking up, rustling through the trees. I made my way back to the cabin after a quick check of the park. There was something strange about the stillness tonight, something I couldn't quite shake. The usual noise of wildlife was absent, and the forest felt unnervingly quiet. I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the season. The trees, barren of leaves, swaying under the pressure of the wind. I locked the door behind me and went about my usual evening routine. A quick dinner, checking the radio for any updates, and preparing for the long night ahead. The cabin had no electricity, save for a few solar-powered lights, so everything ran on oil lamps and a small propane stove. As I settled into my chair by the fire, something gnawed at the back of my mind, a feeling of being watched. I told myself it was just the isolation of the park playing tricks on me. It wasn't uncommon for me to get jumpy after a few hours alone in the woods. But tonight was different. The cabin felt wrong. I rose to check the windows, peering out into the woods. Nothing, just the usual dance of shadows cast by the wind through the trees. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation. I went back to the fire, trying to distract myself. The glow from the flames flickered in the dark room, casting long, eerie shadows along the walls. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. It must have been around midnight when I heard it. A knock, soft at first, then louder, like someone was tapping on the walls. My heart skipped a beat. The cabin was isolated. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and no one had a reason to be out here at this time of night. I froze, straining to listen. The knock came again, but this time it was different. It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the woodshed. I grabbed the flashlight, the beam shaking slightly in my hand, and made my way to the back door. Nothing. I stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the dark woods. It was strange, but there was no sign of movement, no sound, not even the rustling of leaves. The wind had stopped. I had to admit it was getting to me. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting me in waves, and looked around, flashlights sweeping the area. Everything was still, too still. My boots crunched on the dirt path as I walked toward the woodshed. There was nothing there, no signs of anyone having been nearby. Just the usual forest debris, an abandoned woodpile, and a few old tools that had seen better days. I let out a slow breath, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. It wasn't the first time I'd gotten spooked during a night shift, but then I heard it again, this time from deeper in the woods. A sharp, quick snap like a branch breaking under the weight of something large. I froze, my heartbeat picking up again. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. I turned back toward the cabin, then stopped dead in my tracks. The door had been left slightly ajar. I hadn't left it like that. Adrenaline surged through me. I rushed back to the cabin, my thoughts racing. Who would be out here at this hour? Why was the door open? I burst inside, scanning the dark corners of the room with the flashlight. My eyes immediately fell on something odd. A pair of muddy boots just inside the doorway, tucked out of view. No one should have been inside. I moved to the counter, grabbing the radio to call in, but as I turned, I heard something behind me. A low creak. I whipped around, my flashlight beam catching the figure standing in the far corner of the room. A man. I didn't know how long he had been standing there, but he wasn't wearing any uniform, just a worn flannel shirt and faded jeans. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but I could see his eyes, cold and unblinking, staring right at me. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The world around me felt like it was closing in. Then the man spoke. His voice was rough, like gravel, and his words barely made sense. I need help. The road, blocked, can't get out. I couldn't make sense of what he was saying, but the urgency in his voice made my stomach twist. I forced myself to speak, though my voice was shaky. Who are you? What are you doing here? His eyes didn't leave mine, but he didn't answer right away. The silence was suffocating. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he seemed to notice the boots in the corner and step back, his foot catching the edge of a chair. Couldn't help but flinch. Something wasn't right. I took a cautious step forward, ready to defend myself if needed. I glanced at the door, considering my options. Could I make it to the radio? Should I try to get out of the cabin? Before I could decide, the man's gaze flicked to something behind me. I followed his eyes, turning just in time to see a shadow dart past the window. Another figure. This wasn't right. I had to get out. My mind screamed at me to act, but my body felt paralyzed. The man in front of me seemed to notice my hesitation and took a slow step forward, his hands raised, palms outward in a strange gesture. I didn't trust him. I didn't trust any of this. Then came a loud bang from outside, something heavy hitting the cabin wall. It sent me jumping back, and I barely caught myself before I stumbled. My heart raced. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew one thing. I wasn't alone in that cabin anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed to the back door, trying to get outside, but when I opened it, the wind hit me like a wall. My vision blurred in the gusts, and I squinted, trying to see through the darkness. The trees swayed violently, and I thought I saw figures moving between them. My mind raced. I had to get to the truck. I didn't look back as I ran toward the truck, the light from the cabin barely visible in the distance. I could hear footsteps behind me, but I didn't dare stop to see who was following. The sound of breathing, uneven and erratic, made me pick up my pace. My feet felt heavy, like they were trapped in thick mud, but I pushed myself harder, adrenaline carrying me forward. When I reached the truck, I scrambled to unlock the door, my hands shaking as I gripped the handle. Finally, I got inside, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station in town, a good 20 miles away. My hands were still trembling when I parked, and I didn't know if it was from the cold or the terror that had nearly consumed me. I never went back to the cabin after that night. They found the man later wandering near a different part of the park, but they never could figure out who he was or what he was doing there. No sign of the second person I thought I saw. No trace of anything that made sense. But I knew one thing. That night, something was out there. Something far worse than I could ever understand. And it had followed me. I was 28 when I found myself alone at a cabin in the middle of nowhere. The cabin sat nestled in a small valley, surrounded by a thick, dense forest. A place so isolated that you could hear the wind through the trees and nothing else. No cars, no towns, just the occasional bird or the rustle of animals scurrying through the underbrush. It was supposed to be peaceful, a retreat, a break from the noise of everyday life. I had been feeling worn out from work and the constant rush of life. So when I stumbled upon this remote cabin while looking for a weekend getaway, it felt like the perfect spot. I had rented it through a website that specialized in off-the-beaten-path properties. The pictures showed a charming little cabin with rustic wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a small kitchen, perfect for a few days of quiet. The drive there was long. The road eventually narrowed, the asphalt cracking and then vanishing into gravel. There were no signs, no directions after a certain point. I had to follow my GPS, which seemed to take me deeper and deeper into the wilderness. The trees grew taller, the shadows longer, and the air got heavier. By the time I arrived, the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting an orange glow over the landscape. It felt almost otherworldly. I parked the car by the cabin and grabbed my bag. The cabin itself seemed even more isolated in person. It was small but sturdy looking, with a wraparound porch and large windows. The kind of place you'd imagine a hermit or woodsman would live in. The thought crossed my mind briefly. Would anyone ever find me out here? I pushed it aside, shaking the unease that threatened to settle. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind, but a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to suffocate the air around me. The only sound was the creaking of the cabin's wooden beams, as if the house itself was settling into the ground, adjusting to its environment. I grabbed the key from under the doormat and unlocked the door. Inside, the cabin was as described, rustic, cozy even. The fireplace had a pile of wood stacked neatly beside it. A small couch sat in front of the fire, a bookshelf with a few tattered novels and old board games. The kitchen was simple, a few essentials scattered around the countertops. I dropped my bag onto the bed in the back room and took a moment to survey my surroundings. There was something strange about it, though. I couldn't quite place it, but it felt as though the place had been abandoned for a long time, despite the fact that it had clearly been maintained. There was dust on the shelves, a few spider webs in the corners, but nothing that suggested anyone had stayed there recently. Still, I brushed off the odd feeling, unpacked my things, and decided to settle in for the night. The first few hours were uneventful. I made a simple dinner, watched the sun dip lower into the horizon from the porch, and then spent some time reading by the fire. The dark settled in, the kind of dark that stretches across the landscape like a blanket, swallowing up everything but the lights in the cabin. I had a small flashlight on the table, but I didn't need it. The fire crackled softly, and the occasional owl hooted in the distance. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt so alone, so cut off from the world. But as the night wore on, I began to hear things. At first, it was just the occasional creak of the wood in the walls. I told myself it was just the house adjusting to the temperature drop outside. But then came the sounds from outside. I wasn't sure what it was at first. I thought it might be an animal, a deer, or maybe a fox moving around in the underbrush. But the sounds were deliberate, like someone was moving through the trees, stepping carefully around the branches and leaves. I froze in place, listening. The sounds grew louder, closer. The wind howled through the trees, but these noises weren't the random rustling of leaves. No, these sounds were too organized, too purposeful. I went to the window and peered outside, but the darkness was thick. There was no movement, no shape in the trees, just the swaying branches. My heartbeat quickened, and a strange sense of dread began to settle in my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there, that someone or something was watching me. I moved away from the window and paced the cabin, my eyes darting nervously to the door and the windows. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the sounds hadn't stopped. They were still there, but now I could hear them clearly. A faint crunching of leaves and the snap of twigs underfoot. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The cold air hit me like a slap to the face. The woods were still, save for the slight rustling of branches in the wind. There was nothing. I stood there for a long while, scanning the tree line, my flashlight sweeping across the dark shapes of the woods. But there was no one there. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I had let my imagination run wild. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to focus on something else. But the feeling lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. Later that night, I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound, every shift in the wind, made me jump. My mind kept racing, replaying the noises I had heard earlier, trying to rationalize them. Animals, wind, branches moving. But the nagging feeling never left. Around 3 a.m., I woke up with a start. The sound was back, but this time it was closer. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was outside. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing visible through the glass, but I swore I could see something out there, a figure standing still just beyond the reach of my light. The shape was barely perceptible, but it was there. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my phone and dialed the local ranger station. There was a small town about an hour away, and I figured they could help. I was shaky, but I forced myself to sound calm when the person on the other end picked up. "Hello?" The voice answered groggily. "I'm at a cabin up in the hills. I think someone's out there. I don't know if it's a person or what, but I hear noises outside. It's scaring me." There was a long pause. "Where exactly are you?" I gave them the directions, though I could already hear the skepticism in the voice. "Look, it's not a joke. I need someone to check it out." The ranger sighed. "It's probably just some local wildlife. This place is remote. I'll let you know if we get any reports, but you're probably fine." I felt my stomach drop. "Please, just send someone." There was another pause before the voice softened. "All right, I'll let the guys know, but it'll be a while. Hang tight." I hung up, feeling more uneasy than before. The silence in the cabin seemed to thicken. I sat by the window, the flashlight in my hand, waiting for any sign of movement. Time passed slowly. I wasn't sure how much time had gone by, but the sounds outside had stopped. The next few hours felt like a blur. I don't know when I finally fell asleep, but when I woke up, the sun had already risen. It was late morning. The night had been long, full of strange, unsettling thoughts. I stepped outside, still groggy from lack of sleep, and made my way to the edge of the forest, the place where I had seen the figure earlier. There were no signs of anyone. No footprints, no broken branches, no evidence that anyone had been there. Just the quiet, still woods. In the end, I couldn't explain it. I didn't hear the noises again, nor did I see anything else strange. It wasn't until I was leaving the cabin, packing up the last of my things to head back to civilization, that I found it. Hidden under a pile of firewood outside the cabin was a small note, scrawled in hurried handwriting. "Don't come back." The ink was smeared, as though it had been written in a rush or by someone shaking. I left the cabin that day, my heart heavy with the weight of an unease I couldn't shake. I don't know who wrote that note or what the figure in the woods had been, but I was never going back. I was 35 the year I decided to take a solo trip into the Adirondacks. It was late October 2018, and the leaves had already turned to fire, amber, rust, gold. I had burned out after years working construction jobs in upstate New York, and a friend of mine had just moved to Oregon. He left behind an old hunting cabin his grandfather had built decades ago, said I could use it anytime I wanted. The place was about a 2-hour hike from the nearest road. No cell service, no power lines, no other cabins within miles. It sat tucked in a narrow valley near the base of a ridgeline where the forest grew thick and the trails were mostly deer paths. I had been up there with him once before, years ago. I remembered it being peaceful, silent, but I also remembered how quickly the shadows closed in once the sun started to fall. Still, I packed for a week and headed out on a Tuesday morning. I figured I'd clear my head, maybe hunt a little if I felt like it, and just enjoy being alone for a while. I didn't take a gun, just a decent knife, some tools, and a bolt-action pellet rifle for small game. The last thing I expected was any kind of real trouble. The hike in was harder than I remembered. The trailhead was overgrown, and by the time I found the cabin, it was almost 4 in the afternoon. The cabin looked just as it had years ago. Single room, small porch, tin roof. There was an old woodshed off to the left and an outhouse a short walk downhill. I dropped my pack on the porch and stood there for a while, listening. I could hear wind in the trees, nothing else. No planes, no trucks, no voices. It was like stepping out of time. I swept the place out, started a small fire in the old iron stove, and cooked a can of beans with some jerky. The first night, I slept hard. I woke up to cold air and a strange smell, like someone had been burning meat just outside the cabin. Not with smoke. It was faint, but it was enough to make me step outside in my thermals and boots. The morning was still, pale, and the sky above was smeared with a dull silver haze. I walked the area around the cabin but saw nothing. No footprints, no animals, just a faint whiff of something that didn't belong. I figured maybe something had died nearby. A fox or raccoon could have dragged a carcass into the woods, maybe buried it. The soil around here was soft. I pushed it out of my mind and went about splitting wood. Around midday, I walked the perimeter with a small field notebook, marking down anything I thought I could forage. Mushrooms, berries, whatever was left of the season. The place was mostly quiet, but every now and then I thought I heard something strange from up the ridge. Not voices, just sharp, metallic clicks like a hammer tapping stone. A steady rhythm, always in groups of 3. I kept looking back that way, half expecting to see another hunter or maybe someone surveying. But it was just trees, empty woods. Still, I cut my walk short and made it back to the cabin before 3. I didn't sleep as well that second night. I kept hearing things. Twigs snapping near the porch, small rustling movements. I'd get up, step outside, and the woods would be dead silent. By morning, I felt hungover, like I hadn't really slept at all. On the 3rd day, I went up the ridge myself. I had a rough idea of the trail that led there. If you followed the creek uphill and curved east, it would eventually lead you to a kind of overhang. There was a ridge just beyond that with a narrow pass between 2 large boulders. My friend's grandfather had used the area for scouting elk, back when they still wandered through. I found the ridge around 11 and made it to the boulders by noon. The view was incredible. Miles of rolling forest, yellow and orange, framed by dark pines. But I didn't feel relaxed. Something was wrong up there. The air smelled strange again, and I found marks in the soil behind the rocks. Not footprints exactly, just disturbances. Something or someone had knelt there recently. The dirt was pressed flat, and the grass had been crushed in a wide, awkward pattern. I thought maybe a bear had bedded down, but there were no claw marks, no fur, no droppings, and the same smell lingered: burnt meat, dry rot, something chemical. I didn't stay long. That night, I locked the door for the first time. It was just an old deadbolt, probably more symbolic than functional. I left my knife beside the cot and kept the stove going low. I didn't want to hear the silence anymore. I needed some kind of noise. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. The sharp, rhythmic clicks, 3 in a row, pause, 3 more. Closer this time, maybe just outside the tree line. Then something brushed the cabin wall. Just one long scrape. I sat up, heart pounding, and held still. The fire was low, casting long shadows. Nothing else happened. By morning, I found the back window cracked. A thin line down the center of the glass, like it had been tapped with something metal. I checked the woodshed. The outhouse circled the entire place twice. No prints, no tracks, no damage to the door, just that cracked pane. I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe the cold had stressed the glass. I patched it with duct tape and tried to eat something, but I was losing my appetite. Everything tasted like ash. That afternoon, I found something half buried near the creek. A knife, not mine. A long, rusted blade with a cracked wooden handle. Looked homemade. The grip was wrapped in what might have been cloth once, but now it was stiff, dark with age, maybe blood. I left it where I found it. That night, it got worse. I had just started to doze off when something heavy hit the roof. Not a branch, something with weight. Then another thud, toward the far end. I sat up, slipped my boots on, and listened. Whatever it was, it moved slow, deliberate steps, one at a time, then silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The 5th day, I decided to leave. I packed before sunrise and was on the trail by 7. I didn't care about the food I left behind. I just wanted to be out of the woods before nightfall. But as I hiked, I had the creeping feeling that something was behind me. Not close, not visible, but always just far enough to stay out of sight. I made it halfway to the road when I realized I was off trail. The trees looked wrong. The slope was too steep. I turned around, tried to backtrack, but somehow I had circled without noticing. My footprints were there, crisscrossing themselves in the soft soil, like I'd been walking in loops. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing I didn't recognize. In the center was a pile of rocks, stacked intentionally. Not a cairn, just a crude tower of flat stones. At the top sat the same knife I'd left by the creek. I didn't touch it. I turned and kept walking. As darkness fell, I accepted that I wasn't getting out that night. I set up a crude shelter against a fallen log, kept my back to it, and built a small fire. I didn't sleep. All night I heard movement, not animals, something bipedal, pacing slowly around the perimeter of the clearing. No light, no sound but the occasional crunch of leaves. By morning, the rocks were gone. So was the knife. I finally found the trail again around 10 the next morning. I ran most of the way back to my truck. I didn't stop until I hit asphalt. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. The truck started on the second try. I drove without stopping, all the way to Scroon Lake, where I found a small motel and checked in. I didn't speak to anyone, just locked the door and sat in the shower for an hour. I never told anyone what happened out there. A few months later, my friend came back to New York for a visit. He asked if I had used the cabin. I told him yes, but didn't give him the details. Just said the place felt different. He nodded, then said his grandfather had always claimed something wasn't right with that ridge. That sometimes things would go missing, animals would refuse to go near it. Said the old man even found traps sprung with no sign of game. Once, he found a deer caught in a snare, skinned clean, but the meat untouched, just left there. I listened, said nothing, and I never went back. It's been years now, and sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night convinced I hear that same rhythmic tapping. 3 clicks. Pause. 3 more. I moved south, took a job in Tennessee. I haven't been in the woods since, but I still think about that knife, the cracked glass, the sound of something slow and heavy walking across the roof. I don't believe in monsters, but I believe in people. And I believe someone was up there with me. Someone who had been there a long, long time.